Easter Sunday, 1478, Florence Cathedral, at the holiest moment of the Mass, as 10,000 faithful are bowed in worship, the assassins, backed by the Pope himself, choose to strike. 19 stab wounds turned Giuliano de Medici from Florence's golden prince into a corpse on the cathedral floor. His brother Lorenzo survives only by luck, a priest's clumsy touch giving him one precious second to draw his sword and fight for his life in what was meant to be his execution. In that instant, the Renaissance ideal bled out on the altar stones, and the man who would save it had to become a monster to do so. This is the story of Lorenzo de Medici, the poet who became a tyrant, the patron who discovered that to preserve paradise, you must first be willing to rule in hell. If these dark tales resonate with you, consider subscribing and let us know where you're listening from. I'm curious who else understands that the brightest light attracts the darkest enemies. Now take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your cozier spot. Let the modern world fade away as we drift back, not to that bloody Easter morning, but to the Florence that existed before, to sunrise walks and poetry discussions, when Lorenzo still believed that beauty alone could transform the world. The morning mist still clung to the Arno when Lorenzo de Medici made his way through the sleeping streets of Florence. This was his favourite hour, before the merchants opened their shutters, before the hammering began in the workshops, before the city remembered it had business more pressing than beauty. His footsteps echoed off the narrow walls as he moved through his city like a lover through a familiar embrace. Here was the corner where Donatello had first shown him the clay model for his David. There was the palazzo where his grandfather Cosimo had taught him that money was just another kind of paint, something to create with, not hoard. And ahead, already awake despite the early hour, was the workshop that drew him like a moth to flame. The smell hit him first. That intoxicating mixture of a linseed oil, pigment, and possibility that marked an artist's studio. Lorenzo's damaged nose, flattened in a youthful brawl and utterly insensitive to most odours, could somehow still detect this particular perfume, perhaps because it wasn't really a smell at all, but the scent of creation itself. Inside, Sandro Botticelli stood before a canvas that would one day be called Primavera, though for now it was just a collection of figures emerging from the white ground like souls swimming up from purgatory. The artist didn't turn at Lorenzo's entrance. He knew that peculiar shuffle, that slightly laboured breathing of a man whose body had never quite matched his spirit. Lorenzo studied the painting in progress. This radical departure from 1,000 altarpieces. Here was Venus in her garden, surrounded not by saints but by the ancient gods. Here was beauty for its own sake, its philosophy made flesh, humanism given form. It was everything the Renaissance promised, a world where man could stand as proudly as any deity, where wisdom was as holy as prayer, where beauty itself was a kind of worship. They talked as equals, these two, the ugly prince and the divine artist, not of commissions or payments, but of Ficino's translations of Plato, of the sacred geometry hidden in a woman's face, of how to capture divinity without painting God. Lorenzo's voice, that harsh nasal rasp that made courtiers wince, softened when he spoke of such things. In this room, he wasn't the magnificent. He was just a man who understood that beauty was the only immortality worth chasing. But even paradises have snake pits, and Lorenzo's was the counting house of the Medici Bank. The ledgers told a story less beautiful than any Botticelli canvas, where his grandfather Cosimo had been a financial genius. Lorenzo was merely competent. Where his father Piero had been cautious, Lorenzo was distracted. The bank that had built their dynasty was bleeding florins like a pierced artery, its foreign branches collapsing under the weight of loans to princes who considered repayment an insult to their dignity. Lorenzo knew the numbers. He understood that every fresco he commissioned, every manuscript he collected, Every artist he housed was paid for with borrowed time. The Medici fortune was a beautiful facade with termites in the foundation. But what was the alternative? To become like the patsy, those grasping merchants who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing? To let Florence sink back into being just another commercial city, remarkable only for its wool and its counting houses? No. If the choice was between a beautiful decline and an ugly survival, Lorenzo would choose beauty every time. After all, who remembered the balanced books of dead bankers, but a single Botticelli painting? That was eternal. It was on one of these dawn wanderings that Lorenzo paused before the Pazzi Palace. Even at this hour, he could see lights burning in the windows. Francesco de Pazzi, no doubt, hunched over his own ledgers, tallying every florin the Medici's largesse had cost him. The Pazzi were old blood, older than the Medici, with money enough to buy half of Florence, but they lacked what Lorenzo possessed. The vision to see that power wasn't about what you owned, but what you could inspire. Still, as Lorenzo studied those lit windows, a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Pazzi had been growing bolder lately. Their patriarch, Jacopo, had stopped acknowledging him in the streets. Francesco's hatred was so palpable, it seemed to leave frost on the windows when he passed. And there were whispers. There were always whispers in Florence, of meetings in Rome, of papal audiences, of alliances being forged in darkness. Lorenzo pulled his cloak tighter and continued his walk. Let them scheme in their counting houses. He had Botticelli and Poliziano, Ficino and young Leonardo. He had philosophy and poetry, art and ideals. Surely these were stronger than any conspiracy, more enduring than any crown. But as he made his way back to the Medici palace, the sky lightening to the colour of old blood, Lorenzo couldn't shake the feeling that his beautiful world was more fragile than he'd allowed himself to believe. The Renaissance was a glorious dream, but dreams have a way of ending badly when the dreamers refuse to wake. He paused at his palace gates, looking back over the city he loved more than his own life. Florence lay before him like a sleeping beauty, waiting for the sun's kiss to wake her. How many more dawns would he have like this? How many more moments of perfect peace before the termites finally brought the whole structure crashing down? Lorenzo didn't know that he had less than a year before his answer would come at the point of a blade. He didn't know that the very beauty he'd nurtured would soon require a guardian more terrible than any tyrant. He only knew that the morning was perfect, that somewhere Botticelli was mixing pigments like an alchemist seeking gold, and that for this moment at least, the dream was still alive. He entered his palace as the city bells began to ring, calling Florence to another day of commerce and creation. Behind him, in the Pazzi windows, the lights still burned, and in Rome, a pope who loved his nephews more than God was signing papers that would soon turn the cathedral floors red. But that was still to come. For now, there was only the Prince of Poets, walking through his palace halls, composing verses in his harsh voice about beauty and time and the terrible cost of trying to make something eternal in a world built for ending. The Renaissance was at its peak that morning, which meant, of course, that it had nowhere to go but down, and when it fell, it would take Lorenzo's soul with it, leaving behind something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than any poet had a right to become. The verses about beauty and time would have to wait. On Easter Sunday, 1478, it was blood, not ink, that would write Florence's future. The bronze doors of the sacristy slammed shut with a sound like the gates of paradise closing. On one side lay Lorenzo de Medici, bleeding from a shallow neck wound, surrounded by friends who'd formed a human shield around him. On the other side, on the cold marble of the cathedral floor, lay what remained of his brother Giuliano. 19 wounds having ended the young Medici's life in an instant, in that small, dark space behind Luca della Robbia's exquisite doors. Time seemed to stop. The Lorenzo who'd entered the cathedral that morning, the poet, the philosopher, the believer in beauty's redemptive power, drew his last breath. What would emerge when those doors finally opened was something else entirely. He could hear the chaos beyond the bronze barrier, screams echoing off the sacred stones, the clash of steel as his supporters battled the conspirators, the voice of Archbishop Salviati, one of the assassins, shouting orders to seize the government palace, and underneath it all, like a bass note in a funeral mass, the knowledge that everything had changed forever. One of his companions, Antonio Ridolfi, was checking Lorenzo's wound for signs of poison, the fear palpable in the room. Lorenzo watched the dark spot spreading on the sacristy floor and thought, this is what we are reduced to, animals, licking wounds in the dark while beauty bleeds out on the altar. When they finally deemed it safe to exit, when loyal forces had secured the cathedral, Lorenzo walked back into a different world. The conspirators had failed in their larger aim. The government held, the people rallied to the Medici cause, but they had succeeded in something far more profound. They had shown Lorenzo the truth that lay beneath Florence's gilded surface, that beauty without power was just another corpse waiting to happen. He stood over Giuliano's body, this brother who'd shared his blood, his dreams, his vision of what Florence could be. Francesco de Pazzi's rage had been so complete that he'd wounded himself in the frenzy of stabbing, his own blood mixing with Giuliano's on the cathedral floor. Such hatred, such calculated sacrilege. And for what? For money? For power? For the crime of being Medici? No. Lorenzo understood with crystalline clarity as he looked at his brother's destroyed face. They had killed Giuliano for the same reason men always kill beauty, because it makes them see their own ugliness, because it suggests there might be something more valuable than gold in a counting house ledger. The crowd outside the cathedral was already baying for blood. Palla, palla, they chanted. The Medici rallying cry, those golden balls on their coat of arms that symbolized either pills, for their alleged origin as doctors, or coins, for their true profession as bankers. Lorenzo raised his hand for silence. The crowd expected words of moderation, of Christian forgiveness, of the famous Medici restraint. Instead, he gave them something else, permission. His voice, always harsh, now carried an edge that could cut glass. He spoke of justice, but everyone understood he meant revenge. He spoke of order, but everyone heard the promise of terror. He spoke of protecting Florence, but what he really meant was that he would burn the world before he let another drop of Medici blood stain these stones. The transformation was conscious, deliberate, and irrevocable. In that moment, with his brother's blood still wet on the cathedral floor, Lorenzo de Medici made a choice. He would become what his enemies had forced him to become. He would be the tyrant they claimed he already was. He would use their own methods, terror, brutality, the arithmetic of fear. But he would use them better, more completely, with an artist's attention to detail. If they wanted a monster, he would give them one. The vengeance that followed was a masterpiece of calculated brutality. Within hours, Francesco de Pazzi was dragged naked through the streets. That same rage that had driven him to stab Giuliano 19 times now turned impotent as the mob beat him bloody. They hanged him from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. Lorenzo watched from a window, feeling the cold arithmetic of justice settle in his chest where his heart used to be. One conspirator down, so many more to go. But the true artistry came with Archbishop Salviati. Here was a man of God who turned the highest sacrament into a signal for murder. Lorenzo's justice for him was appropriately theological. They hanged him in his full ecclesiastical robes, right next to Francesco de Pazzi's naked corpse, and in his final moments, in some last spasm of hatred or madness, The Archbishop's final moments saw him lurching toward Francesco's body in a last act of rage. Even God's representatives, it seemed, showed their true nature when the noose tightened. Lorenzo filed this observation away with all the other lessons written in blood. Lorenzo watched from the palazzo windows as the bodies swayed in the afternoon breeze. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no horror, just a cold appreciation for the symmetry of it all. They had tried to use God as their weapon. Now God, or at least his representative, hung from a government window. But the artist in Lorenzo couldn't let it end with mere death. The Pazzi had tried to erase the Medici. Lorenzo would show them what erasure truly meant. The systematic destruction of the Pazzi family was a work of art in its own right. In the dead of night, teams of stonemasons moved through Florence like an army of shadows. The sharp ring of hammer on chisel echoed off the narrow streets, a metallic heartbeat that wouldn't stop until every trace of the Pazzi was gone. Stone dust filled the air like incense for a new kind of mass, one dedicated to erasure rather than creation. At the Pazzi chapel in Santa Croce, Lorenzo himself came to watch. The workmen paused, uncertain, as their lord studied the delicate dolphins that had adorned the family's coat of arms for centuries. These weren't just decorations. They were claims to antiquity, to belonging, to the right to exist in Florentine memory. Lorenzo ran his fingers over the carved stone, feeling the craftsmanship of generations, then nodded. The hammers resumed their work. By morning, where the dolphins had swum, only rough scars remained in the stone. It was uglier now, this chapel. But that was the point. Beauty was for the living. The Pazzi were something less than dead. They were unmade. The other great families of Florence, the Strozzi, the Albizzi, the Peruzzi, watched this systematic erasure with growing terror. They gathered in their private chapels and spoke in whispers, understanding the new mathematics of power. It wasn't enough anymore to merely defeat your enemies. You had to delete them from history itself. They looked at their own coats of arms, suddenly seeing them not as symbols of pride, but as targets waiting for the chisel. Some tried to curry favour, volunteering their own workmen to help in the erasure. Others simply ensured their loyalty was loudly proclaimed in every public space. The message had been received. In Lorenzo's Florence, you existed at his pleasure, and that existence could be revoked retroactively. Every member was hunted down, those who'd known of the plot, those who'd suspected, those whose only crime was bearing the name. Their palace was ransacked, their businesses destroyed, their very name declared anathema. By law, anyone named Pazzi had to take a new surname. In the city's registries, as clerks worked by candlelight, crossing out centuries of records, turning a great family into a collective ghost. It wasn't enough to kill them. Lorenzo needed to make it as if they had never existed at all. He stood in the empty Pazzi chapel, watching workmen chisel away centuries of family history, and thought, this is what power means. Not just to build, but to unbuild. Not just to create, but to uncreate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had spent his life creating beauty was now creating absence, crafting a void where a great family had stood. But this too was art of a kind, the art of negation, the sculpture of empty space where something should be. The most grotesque artistic statement came with Jacopo de' Pazzi, the family patriarch. After his execution, he was buried in consecrated ground, but Lorenzo's partisans dug him up, declaring that the presence of a traitor was causing the city's crops to fail. They carried Jacopo's remains through the city, then propped them up at his own palazzo door. Lorenzo heard the reports of children following the corpse, making up mocking songs, and recognized his own transformation in their innocent cruelty. He was teaching Florence new lessons now, lessons written in decomposing flesh. Children followed the procession, poking the corpse with sticks, singing mocking songs. The body was thrown in the Arno, fished out, hung from a tree, beaten like a piñata, then thrown back in the river. It was a ritual desecration that went beyond revenge into something primal, something that belonged more to the ancient darkness before Christianity than to the enlightened Renaissance. And through it all, Lorenzo watched with those eyes that had once gazed with such joy at Botticelli's Venus. The same aesthetic sense that could appreciate the divine proportions of a painting could also orchestrate the perfect degradation of an enemy. But the masterstroke, the final fusion of art and terror, came when Lorenzo commissioned his friend Botticelli to create a lasting monument to this justice. Not a beautiful Venus or a transcendent Madonna, but a fresco on the walls of the Palazzo Vecchio depicting the conspirators hanging by their necks. A pittura infamante, a painting of infamy. The artist who had been creating paradise was now asked to paint hell, and Botticelli, who understood which way the wind was blowing, who knew that in this new Florence you were either Medici or you were nothing, took up his brushes and complied. Lorenzo stood in the artist's studio, the same room where they'd discussed Platonic ideals and divine beauty, and watched as Botticelli sketched the cartoons for the fresco. Each hanged figure was rendered with the same attention to detail that the artist brought to his mythological scenes. The stark truth of justice delivered. The last expression frozen in time. This was to be public art of a new kind, not to inspire or elevate, but to warn and terrorize. Every citizen passing the Palazzo Vecchio would see it and understand. This is what happens to those who strike at the Medici. Beauty and horror were no longer opposites. They were tools in the same workshop, pigments on the same palette. As Botticelli worked, he spoke of technical matters, the difficulty of painting on exterior walls, the best pigments to withstand weather. He didn't speak of what it meant to turn his divine gift into an instrument of state terror. He did not need to. Both men understood that this was the price of survival in the new order Lorenzo was creating. The transformation was complete. The prince of poets had become a prince in truth. And princes, as Machiavelli would later observe, must know how to be both man and beast. Lorenzo had learned the beast part well, perhaps too well. Standing in that studio, watching beauty be conscripted into the service of fear, Lorenzo felt the last of his old self die. He'd saved his family, secured his power, protected his city, but the cost was everything he'd once believed in. Outside, Florence continued its daily business. Merchants traded, artists painted, philosophers debated, the Renaissance went on. But it was different now, stained with blood that no amount of beauty could wash clean, and at its centre sat Lorenzo de Medici, patron of arts and orchestrator of horrors, proof that sometimes to preserve paradise, you first had to become the serpent. The Pope's rage arrived in Florence before his armies did. The execution of Archbishop Salviati, a consecrated priest hanged in his sacred vestments, was an insult Sixtus IV could not let stand. The papal bull of excommunication was a masterwork of ecclesiastical fury, damning Lorenzo as a son of iniquity and foster child of perdition. The entire city of Florence fell under interdict. No mass could be said, no sacrament administered. In the eyes of the church, Florence had become a spiritual wasteland, its citizens' souls as damned as their leaders. But Lorenzo had learned something in that bloody cathedral. Salvation was a luxury he could no longer afford. The war that followed was like watching a slow strangulation. Papal forces, allied with the Kingdom of Naples, pressed in from all sides. Florence's traditional allies, Milan, Venice, sent pretty words but no soldiers. The city that had given the world such beauty found itself alone, surrounded by enemies who smelled weakness in the Arno water. For 2 years, the conflict ground on. Fields were burned, trade routes severed, the economy slowly bled white. The same citizens who'd cried, "Palle, palle," when the Pazzi swung from the palazzo windows now muttered in the marketplaces about the price of Medici pride. empty bellies it seemed, cared little for the finer points of political loyalty. Lorenzo watched his city suffer and made another calculation. If he could not win this war with swords, perhaps he could win it with audacity. The decision to sail to Naples in the winter of 1479 was either the boldest diplomatic stroke of the age or the most elaborate form of suicide ever conceived. King Ferrante of Naples was not known for his mercy. His castle dungeons held a peculiar museum. The mummified corpses of his enemies, preserved and dressed in the clothes they'd worn in life, arranged around a grotesque dining table. The king, it was said, liked to visit them when he needed to think. Lorenzo understood he might soon be joining that silent dinner party. But he also understood something else. Power recognized power, and sometimes the greatest strength was in placing your neck willingly on the block. He told no one of his plans until his ship was already sailing south. The letter he left behind was a masterpiece of political theatre. He was risking his life for Florence, placing himself in his enemy's hands to spare his city further suffering. If he died, he would die a martyr. If he lived, he would return a saviour. The 3 months in Naples were a different kind of performance than any Lorenzo had given before. Here, in Ferrante's court, poetry and philosophy meant nothing. This was a place of pure power, naked and unadorned. The king received him in a hall decorated with the weapons of defeated enemies, a none too subtle reminder of the fate of those who displeased him. The first dinner was a test disguised as hospitality. The great hall of Castelnuovo stretched before Lorenzo like a gilded trap, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own malevolent life. Ferrante sat at the high table like a spider at the centre of his web, his eyes never leaving Lorenzo's face, watching for any sign of weakness. The food itself was a message. Each course was a small masterpiece of Neapolitan cuisine, sea urchins from the Bay of Naples, lamb so tender it fell from the bone, wines from the volcanic slopes of Vesuvius. But Lorenzo noticed how his portions were always served first, how Ferrante waited until his guest had taken the first bite before touching his own plate. The possibility of poison hung in the air like an unspoken course between each dish. "Tell me," Ferrante said, his voice carrying the particular softness of a man who never needed to raise it. "What do you think of my collection?" He gestured to the walls where ancient weapons hung. Swords that had pierced royal hearts, daggers that had opened noble throats, each one labelled with the name of its victim and the date of their demise. It was history written in steel and dried blood. Lorenzo sipped his wine, feeling the weight of the moment. Every word would be weighed, every gesture analysed. He thought of Florence, of his children, of Botticelli's unfinished canvases. Fear coiled in his stomach like a cold serpent, but his hand remained steady. "I think," Lorenzo said finally, allowing his ugly face to arrange itself into something almost like a smile, "that a wise collector knows when to stop acquiring new pieces." Ferrante laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "Come," he said, rising from the table, "let me show you my most prized possessions." The descent into the castle's lower chambers was a journey into calculated madness. The air grew thick and sweet with the smell of preservation oils, and then Lorenzo saw them. Ferrante's true collection, the mummified remains of his enemies, arranged in a grotesque parody of a feast. They sat in their funeral finery, these dried husks that had once been counts and princes, their preserved faces frozen in whatever expression death had given them. "My council of advisers," Ferrante said, running an affectionate hand along one withered shoulder. "They never disagree with me now." Lorenzo felt his gorge rise, but forced himself to study the scene with an aesthete's eye. This was power stripped of all pretense, all beauty, all philosophy. This was what authority looked like when it no longer bothered to dress itself in righteousness. Fascinating, he managed, and meant it. Here was his future if he failed. Not just death, but eternal humiliation, transformed into a prop in a madman's theatre. For 3 months, this psychological warfare continued. By day, Lorenzo deployed every weapon in his arsenal, his intelligence, his charm, his deep pockets. He spoke as one prince to another, laying out with cold clarity why Florente's alliance with the Pope was a mistake. Sixtus IV wanted to devour Florence. Yes, but his appetite would not stop there. A Pope who could destroy the Medici could destroy anyone. Better to have a strong, independent Florence as a buffer than to help create a papal monster that would eventually turn on Naples itself. By night, Lorenzo lay awake in chambers that might become his tomb, feeling the weight of every portrait watching him, wondering if those painted eyes belonged to men who'd slept in this same bed before joining Ferrante's silent council. The paranoia was suffocating. Every servant might be an assassin, every cup of wine a final communion. He had placed himself entirely in the hands of a man who collected his enemies like art. But slowly, impossibly, it worked. Ferrante began to see not an enemy but an opportunity. This ugly man with the harsh voice had something the beautiful courtiers around him lacked. An understanding of how the world actually worked, not how it appeared in paintings. More importantly, Lorenzo understood that sometimes the greatest victory was not in crushing your enemy, but in transforming him into an asset. "You would make an interesting addition to my collection," Ferrante mused one evening as they walked among the mummies. "But I think you're more valuable to me alive. At least for now." It was as close to friendship as a man like Ferrante could offer, a stay of execution with an expiration date to be determined. When Lorenzo finally returned to Florence in March of 1480, he came not as a prisoner but as a victor. The bells of the city rang out in celebration. The Pope, abandoned by his chief ally, was forced to lift the interdict and make peace. Lorenzo had won not through force of arms, but through the sheer audacity of putting his head in the lion's mouth and convincing the lion it wasn't hungry. But victories in the real world always come with a price. Lorenzo used the political capital he'd gained to restructure Florence's government, creating a new Council of 70 packed with Medici loyalists. The Republic, that beautiful fiction Florence told itself, was finally and officially dead. In its place rose something harder and more honest, a principality that still called itself free. The transformation of Florence's government was like watching Botticelli paint over a fresco. The old forms remained, the councils, the elections, the ceremonies, but underneath was something entirely different. Every position of real power was held by a Medici ally. Every decision of importance passed through Lorenzo's hands. The painted surface still showed a republic, but the reality beneath was autocracy. And with this new power came a new relationship with art itself. Lorenzo's patronage, always lavish, now became almost frantic. He commissioned works at a pace that would have been remarkable even if the Medici Bank hadn't been hemorrhaging florins. Palaces rose from the ground like marble prayers. Manuscripts were collected with the desperation of a man trying to buy immortality, one illuminated page at a time. But there was something different about this late patronage. Where once Lorenzo had commissioned art for the pure joy of beauty, now each work served a purpose. A fresco here to remind citizens of Medici generosity, a sculpture there to suggest divine approval of their rule. Even beauty had been conscripted into the service of power. The artist felt the change. Where once Lorenzo had been a friend and fellow seeker of truth, now he was unmistakably the patron, the man who paid, who therefore commanded. Botticelli still painted his mythological scenes, but now Venus looked a bit more like a Medici bride. Poliziano still wrote his verses, but now they sang of Lorenzo's wisdom in war as much as his taste in art. The transformation was most visible in the new Palazzo Lorenzo commissioned. Unlike the relatively modest family home built by his grandfather, this was a fortress dressed as a palace. The walls were thick enough to withstand artillery. The windows were placed high. better for defence than for light. It was beauty with its armour showing, art that never forgot it might need to fight. Lorenzo would walk through the construction site in the evenings, his gout making each step painful, his body betraying him even as his power reached its zenith. He would run his hands over the marble, Carrara's finest, ruinously expensive, and feel nothing of the joy that stone once brought him. This wasn't creation anymore, it was fortification. The irony was as perfect as it was bitter. He had saved Florence, saved the Renaissance, saved everything he claimed to love, but in saving it, he had transformed it into something else. A beautiful prison where art served power and power served only itself. One evening, as the sun set over the Arno, Lorenzo found himself again in Botticelli's studio. The artist was working on what would become the birth of Venus, that supreme vision of beauty emerging from the sea foam. But Lorenzo couldn't see the goddess anymore. All he could see were the calculations, how much this cost, what message it sent, which enemies it might placate or provoke. Botticelli must have sensed his patron's mood, because he set down his brushes and poured them both wine. They drank in silence. These two men who had once talked until dawn about beauty and truth. There was nothing left to say. They both knew what they had become, the tyrant and his propagandist, locked in a dance of mutual dependence that would last until one or both of them died. As Lorenzo left the studio that night, he paused at the door. Behind him, Botticelli had returned to his painting, adding another layer of divine beauty to his goddess. Ahead of him lay the city he ruled, Florence the Magnificent, Florence the Terrified, Florence the golden cage he had built with his own hands. He thought of that morning years ago when he had walked these same streets as a young man in love with beauty, that Lorenzo would not recognize the man he had become, that Lorenzo had believed beauty could save the world. This Lorenzo knew better. Beauty needed protection, and protection required ugliness. It was a lesson written in his brother's blood and sealed with papal wars. The Renaissance would continue. Art would flourish. Florence would remain the wonder of Europe, but it would all rest on a foundation of calculated terror and carefully managed fear. That was the price Lorenzo had paid, not just with gold, but with his soul. And the terrible truth, the one that kept him awake in his marble palace, was that he would pay it again. 1,000 times over, he would pay it. Because in the end, wasn't a corrupted Renaissance better than no Renaissance at all? Wasn't beauty worth any price? Even if that price was becoming the very thing beauty was meant to transcend. Lorenzo de Medici went home to his fortress palace, his body aching, his mind never resting, his hands stained with invisible blood that no amount of patronage could wash clean. Behind him, Florence glittered in the darkness like a jewel in a crown of thorns, beautiful, precious, and sharp enough to draw blood from anyone who tried to hold it. The gout came for Lorenzo the way time comes for everyone, slowly at first, then all at once. By his 42nd year, the disease that had crippled his father and grandfather had made a gnarled ruin of his hands. Those fingers that had once traced the curves of ancient manuscripts could barely hold a cup. The legs that had carried him through Florence's dawn streets now struggled to bear him from bed to window. But physical decay was almost a relief compared to the spiritual arthritis that had seized his soul. He ruled a Florence more prosperous than ever, more beautiful than Athens, more powerful than his grandfather could have dreamed. And he felt nothing but the weight of it all. The city had become a perfectly functioning machine of his design. The Council of 70 met when he told them to meet, decided what he told them to decide. The artist painted what advanced Medici glory. The philosophers philosophized within carefully prescribed limits. Even the preachers knew which sins to condemn and which to politely ignore. It should have been triumph. Instead, it felt like death. A beautiful, gilded death that smelled of oil paint and tasted of ashes. In those final months, Lorenzo found himself drawn repeatedly to the church of San Marco. Not for prayer, he'd given up on God's forgiveness long ago, but to hear a different kind of sermon. The new prior, Girolamo Savonarola, preached with a fire that made the old certainties burn. Savonarola was everything Lorenzo had once crushed. A voice of dissent, a prophet of change, a man who looked at Medici Florence and saw not beauty but blasphemy. From his pulpit, the friar denounced the pagan excesses of the Renaissance, the worship of beauty over virtue, the rule of tyrants who dressed themselves in philosophers' robes. Lorenzo could have silenced him. A word to the right people, a little pressure properly applied, and the troublesome friar would have found himself transferred to some distant monastery. But Lorenzo didn't give that word. Perhaps he was too tired, perhaps he was curious, or perhaps, in some perverse way, he needed Savonarola, needed someone to speak the truths his court would never dare whisper. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. As Lorenzo's body failed, as the physicians shook their heads and prescribed increasingly desperate remedies, someone suggested bringing the holy man to the dying prince's bedside. If earthly medicine had failed, perhaps heavenly intervention might succeed. Lorenzo agreed, though he knew what was coming. This would be no comfortable absolution from a court priest grown fat on Medici gold. This would be a reckoning. They brought him to the villa at Careggi on a spring morning in 1492. The same villa where his grandfather had died, where his father had breathed his last. The Medici seemed to die as they lived, surrounded by beauty they could no longer see. Savonarola entered the death chamber like judgment itself. He was a small man, ugly as Lorenzo himself, with eyes that burned with the kind of certainty that had once lit cathedral pyres. He looked at the dying prince, this man who had ruled Florence, who had shaped the Renaissance, and who had turned art into power and power into art, and saw only a soul in need of saving. The conditions for absolution were simple enough at first. Faith in God's mercy. Lorenzo had that. The desperate faith of the dying, perhaps, but faith nonetheless. He nodded his agreement, his throat too raw for words. Restoration of ill-gotten gains. This was harder. The Medici fortune was so entangled with Florence itself that to restore it would be to tear down half the city. But Lorenzo nodded again. What were ducats to a dying man? Let his heirs sort out the details. Then came the third condition, and Lorenzo knew why fate had brought this particular confessor to his deathbed. The friar leaned close enough that Lorenzo could smell the honest poverty on his rough robes, could see the conviction burning in those terrible eyes. Savonarola demanded that Lorenzo restore Florence's liberty, that he undo the careful architecture of power he'd spent his life building, that he give back the republic he'd strangled in its sleep. The silence stretched between them like a century. Here was Lorenzo's last chance, not just for absolution, but for redemption. He could speak a word and undo everything. Free Florence, free himself, die as the prince of poets he'd once been rather than the tyrant he'd become. But he couldn't, or wouldn't. The distinction hardly mattered anymore. Lorenzo turned his face to the wall, and Savonarola left without granting absolution. The most powerful man in Florence would die unshriven, his soul as stained as his legacy was bright. He lingered for a few more days, this man who had lived so fiercely. They say he spoke at the end, though no one could agree on what he said. Some heard him reciting poetry, his own verses about spring and youth and the terrible brevity of beauty. Others swore he was reviewing accounts, still trying to balance books that would never close. But those who were closest, who leaned in to catch his final breath, heard something else, a question, repeated over and over, growing fainter with each asking, was it worth it? Was it worth it? Was it? Lorenzo de Medici died on April 8, 1492, as a storm rolled in from the mountains. Lightning struck the cupola of the cathedral where his brother had been murdered, where his transformation had begun. The city's prophets would later claim this as a sign of God's judgment. The city's pragmatists simply noted that April was always unpredictable in Florence. They buried him in the family chapel at San Lorenzo, surrounded by the art he'd commissioned, the beauty he'd paid for, the magnificence he'd built on a foundation of blood. Botticelli was there, older now, his hands beginning to shake with a palsy that would eventually still them. He looked at his patron's corpse and perhaps remembered a young man who'd stood in his studio talking of Plato until dawn. Florence mourned, of course. The city knew it had lost something irreplaceable, not just a ruler, but the man who'd made them the wonder of the world. But already, even as the funeral bells tolled, the cracks were beginning to show. Savonarola's sermons grew bolder, the people grew restless. The other powers of Italy, held in check for so long by Lorenzo's diplomatic genius, began to circle. Within 2 years, everything Lorenzo had built would begin to crumble. The French would invade, the Medici would be driven into exile, Savonarola would turn Florence into a theocracy, burning the beautiful vanities and great bonfires that consumed paintings and poems and all the glorious excess of the Renaissance. Eventually, they would burn Savonarola too, and the Medici would return. But Florence would never again be what it was under Lorenzo. But that was all still to come. For now, there was only a tomb and a question that would echo through the centuries. What is the price of beauty? What is the cost of preserving something precious in a world that worships only power? Lorenzo de Medici had paid that price in full. He had saved the Renaissance by becoming everything the Renaissance was meant to transcend. He had preserved beauty by embracing ugliness. He had protected the dream by becoming the nightmare. Was it worth it? Perhaps that's not for us to judge. We who live in a world shaped by the art he saved, who can walk through museums filled with the beauty he preserved, what right do we have to condemn the methods that made our inheritance possible? Or perhaps that's exactly why we must judge, because the temptation is always there, to save what we love by becoming what we hate, to preserve paradise by ruling in hell, to pay any price for what we call precious. Lorenzo paid that price. He transformed himself from poet to tyrant, from dreamer to destroyer, from a man who loved beauty to a man who used it. He saved Florence and lost his soul. He preserved the Renaissance and perverted its meaning, and in the end, on his deathbed, facing a friar who demanded he choose between power and paradise, he chose as he had always chosen. He chose the tangible over the eternal, the real over the ideal, the world over the word. He died unshriven but not unmourned, unforgiven but not forgotten, and perhaps that's the most anyone can ask. To be remembered not for what we wish to be, but for what we were, beautiful and terrible, magnificent and monstrous, forever caught between the poetry we dream and the prose we live. Lorenzo de Medici, Il Magnifico, the prince of poets who became the poet of princes, the man who paid the price of the Renaissance and left us forever wondering if the beauty was worth the blood.